Title: The Reunion. It was a cold, rainy night when Sarah received the text from Mark, her ex-boyfriend. The very sight of his name on her screen made her heart skip a beat. It had been 5 years since they last spoke, since she had finally mustered the courage to leave him and his increasingly obsessive behavior behind. "Hey Sarah, I know it's been a long time. I'm in town and was wondering if we could catch up. Maybe over coffee? There's something I need to tell you." She stared at the message, her mind racing. She had blocked him on everything after the breakup, but apparently he had a new number. It was unsettling that he had found a way to contact her, but her curiosity gnawed at her. What could he possibly want after all these years? Against her better judgment, she agreed to meet him at a small cafe on the edge of town, a place they used to frequent when they were together. She told herself it was closure, a chance to put the past to rest once and for all. But deep down, she knew it was something else, a need to face the shadows of her past. The cafe was nearly empty when she arrived, the rain drumming steadily against the windows. A dim light flickered above, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. Sarah's nerves were on edge as she sipped her coffee, waiting for Mark to arrive. The door creaked open, and there he was, looking almost the same as he had all those years ago. Tall, dark hair, the same piercing blue eyes that had once captivated her. But there was something different about him now, something colder. "Sarah," he greeted her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He sat down across from her, and for a moment they just stared at each other in uncomfortable silence. "You look good," Mark finally said, his voice unnervingly calm. "Better than I expected." "Thanks," Sarah replied, forcing a smile. "You too." They made small talk for a while, but Sarah could feel the tension in the air. She could sense that Mark wasn't here just to reminisce. There was a purpose behind his visit, and it was making her increasingly uneasy. "So what did you want to tell me?" she asked, cutting through the pleasantries. Mark's smile faded and his expression grew serious. "I've been thinking about us a lot lately, about what happened between us. I know I was intense, but I've changed, Sarah. I've worked on myself, and I realized that I was wrong. I shouldn't have let you go." Sarah felt a knot tighten in her stomach. "Mark, it's been 5 years. We've both moved on." He leaned in closer, his eyes locking onto hers. "Have you? Really?" There was something in his gaze that made her blood run cold. She suddenly regretted coming here. "Yes, I have. I'm in a good place now." Mark's expression darkened and he reached into his pockets, pulling out something small and metallic. Sarah's breath hitched as he placed it on the table. It was a key, one that looked all too familiar. "Do you recognize this?" he asked quietly. Her mind reeled. It was the key to her old apartment, the one she had shared with Mark during their relationship. She had changed the locks after they broke up, but seeing it now brought a flood of memories, of nights when she would wake up to find Mark staring at her while she slept, of the time she found her phone with messages she hadn't sent, and the moment she realized that leaving him was the only way to escape his suffocating obsession. "How did you get that?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "I never gave it back," Mark said, his tone chillingly matter-of-fact. "I've kept it all these years, just in case." "In case of what?" Sarah whispered, horror dawning on her. "In case you needed me," he said, his voice lowering to a dangerous whisper. "In case you realized that no one could ever love you like I did." Sarah's pulse raced as she pushed her chair back, ready to leave. "This was a mistake. I shouldn't have come." Mark's hand shot out, gripping her wrist with surprising strength. "You can't leave, Sarah. Not yet." She struggled against his grip, her heart pounding. "Let go of me, Mark." He released her, but there was something in his eyes that made her hesitate. He looked hurt, but also desperate. "Please, just listen." Lucky pleaded. "There's something you need to know." Against her better judgment, she stayed, though every instinct screamed at her to run. Mark took a deep breath, his gaze intense. "Do you remember the night you left me?" he asked. Sarah nodded, a chill running down her spine. "Of course I do." "You don't know the whole story," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I didn't just let you go, Sarah. I couldn't. I followed you that night." Her blood ran cold as memories of that night came flooding back. She remembered feeling like someone was watching her, the sense of dread that had gripped her as she hurriedly packed her bags and fled to a friend's house. But she had convinced herself it was just paranoia, a side effect of the fear she had felt in their relationship. "I watched you," Mark continued, his voice taking on a haunting tone. "I watched you go to your friend's house. I stood outside, waiting for hours. I wanted to make sure you were safe, that no one would hurt you." "You were stalking me?" Sarah whispered, the realization hitting her like a ton of bricks. "I was protecting you," Mark insisted. "But then something happened that night, something I need to confess." "What are you talking about?" Sarah asked, dread creeping into her voice. Mark hesitated, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of guilt and fear. "I wasn't the only one watching you that night. There was someone else. I saw him lurking around your friend's house, waiting for you. I don't know who he was, but I knew he meant you harm." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she listened to Mark's words. Could it be true? Had there really been someone else that night? "I couldn't let him hurt you," Mark continued, his voice shaking. "So I followed him, I confronted him, and things escalated. I didn't mean to, but I killed him, Sarah. I did it for you." Sarah stared at him in shock, unable to process what he was saying. "You killed someone?" Mark nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. "I buried him in the woods. No one ever found out. I did it to protect you, to keep you safe, but I've been living with the guilt ever since." She felt sick to her stomach, a wave of nausea overwhelming her. Everything she thought she knew about that night, about Mark, had been turned upside down. "I don't believe you," she whispered, shaking her head. Mark reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "I know it's hard to accept, but it's the truth. I came back because I needed to tell you, to make things right." Sarah pulled her hand away, her mind racing. She needed to get out of there, away from him and his twisted version of reality. "I'm calling the police," she said, standing up. Mark didn't try to stop her. Instead, he looked up at her with a sad smile. "Do what you need to do, Sarah, but remember, I did it for you. I've always done everything for you." She backed away, her heart pounding as she turned and fled from the cafe, her mind reeling with the horror of what she had just heard. As she drove away, her hands trembling on the steering wheel, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was still being watched. Every shadow seemed to move, every car behind her a threat. She glanced at her rearview mirror, half expecting to see Mark's car following her, but there was nothing. It wasn't until she got home and locked herself inside that she allowed herself to breathe. She leaned against the door, trying to make sense of everything. Could it really be true? Had Mark saved her life that night? Or was this just another one of his twisted games? Her phone buzzed, and she nearly jumped out of her skin. It was a text from an unknown number. "I'm still watching. Be careful who you trust." Sarah's blood ran cold as she stared at the message. She suddenly realized that the nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning.
Story number 2.
Whispers in the walls. It had been 3 months since Sarah left Mark. She should have done it sooner, but the fear kept her tethered. She moved to a new apartment across town, a place with bright, open windows and neighbors who seemed friendly enough. The perfect place to start fresh, to forget the way Mark's gaze seemed to pierce her soul, as if he could see every doubt and fear she harbored. But even in this new space, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At first, it was subtle. She'd feel the hair on her neck stand on end, a chill racing up her spine as if a draft had passed through. The sensation would come and go at random moments, while she was brushing her teeth, making dinner, or even reading a book. She'd glance at the window or door, half expecting to see Mark's face peering in, but nothing. Just empty space. It got worse when she started hearing the whispers, soft at first, like the faint hum of static. She would pause, straining to catch the sound, but it would stop the moment she concentrated. "It's in my head," she told herself. "I'm just anxious. He's not here." One night, Sarah was woken by a scratching sound coming from inside the walls. It was a slow, deliberate noise, like nails dragging across wood. She bolted upright in bed, her heart pounding. She grabbed her phone and flicked on the flashlight, scanning the room. Nothing out of place. But then she heard it again. This time, it was closer, almost as if it were just behind her headboard. She called the building manager the next morning. "It's probably just rats," he said dismissively. "Old building, you know. I'll send someone to check it out." A man came by later that day, but he didn't find any signs of rodents. "You sure you heard scratching?" he asked, and she nodded, feeling foolish. If it happens again, let me know. The next few nights were quiet, and Sarah started to think maybe she had imagined the whole thing. But then, just when she was beginning to relax, she woke up to the feeling of someone standing over her. She could hear a faint, rhythmic breathing, soft and shallow. Panic gripped her as she fumbled for the lamp switch, finally managing to turn it on. The room was empty. She lay there, trembling, as the sound faded away. The whispers returned the next day. She was in the shower when she heard them clearly for the first time, a low murmur like someone speaking from far away. She turned off the water and the sound stopped. She waited, dripping and cold, but it didn't return. That night, she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt like she was being watched. She sat up, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the door, half expecting Mark to burst through. Then she heard it, a faint whisper, but this time, it was clearer. Sarah. Her blood ran cold. It was his voice. She bolted from the bed and checked the locks on the door and windows. Everything was secure. She picked up her phone, hands shaking, and dialed her friend Megan. "I think he's here," she whispered. "I think Mark found me." Megan offered to come over, but Sarah declined. "No, it's late. I'll just stay awake for now. I'm probably imagining things." They talked for a while, Megan trying to calm her down, but after hanging up, the feeling of dread only grew. A few nights later, Sarah decided to take a sleeping pill. She hadn't slept in days, and the exhaustion was beginning to fray her nerves. She swallowed the pill with a glass of water and lay down, eyes squeezed shut, trying to block out everything. She was drifting off when she heard the scratching again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. She groggily turned her head toward the sound, her mind clouded by the medication. Her vision blurred, and the room seemed to spin around her. She heard it again, a voice, faint but unmistakable, coming from the wall. "Sarah, let me in." Her eyes shot open. She sat up, but her limbs felt heavy, as if weighed down. She turned her head toward the wall, and in the dim light, she saw something. A dark spot, no bigger than a dime, slowly expanding. She blinked, trying to focus, but the spot kept growing, spreading like ink in water. And then she saw it, a pair of eyes staring at her from within the wall. She screamed, stumbling out of bed, her legs wobbly. The eyes blinked, and she heard Mark's voice again, louder this time. "Sarah, you can't hide from me." She ran to the living room, grabbed her phone, and dialed 911, her voice frantic. "Someone's in my apartment. Please, help me." The operator's calm voice was a stark contrast to her panic. "Stay on the line, ma'am. Officers are on their way." Sarah stood there, heart racing, her back pressed against the wall. She could still hear the whispers, growing louder, more urgent. The dark spot on the bedroom wall seemed to move, like it was pulsing, alive. She waited, her breath coming in ragged gasps until she heard the knock on the door. 2 officers entered, guns drawn. She pointed them to the bedroom, her words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "There! In the wall! He's in the wall!" They moved cautiously, checking every corner, every inch of the room. "There's nothing here," one of the officers said finally, holstering his weapon. "But I heard him! I saw him!" Sarah insisted, tears streaming down her face. They looked at her with a mix of sympathy and skepticism. One of the officers turned to her. "Ma'am, have you been taking any medication?" She shook her head. "No, it's not that. I'm not crazy. I know what I saw." They searched the rest of the apartment but found nothing. "If you hear anything again, call us," the officer said before they left. That night, Sarah sat in her living room, too scared to sleep, her eyes darting to every shadow, and then from the walls she heard it again, a soft, almost mocking whisper. "Sarah, you can never leave me." Her heart pounded, and she turned to the wall. She grabbed a hammer from her kitchen drawer, marched to the bedroom, and began smashing the wall where the eyes had appeared. Plaster crumbled, and she kept hitting, harder and harder, until she broke through to the hollow inside. And there, in the dark, cramped space, she found it, a small speaker, wires trailing into the shadows. Her blood ran cold as realization dawned. Someone had been in her apartment. Someone had planted this. She backed away slowly, her breath shallow, and then she heard it again, a whisper, but this time not from the wall. It was right behind her. "Sarah, you'll never be rid of me."
Story number 3.
Title: The Reflection. Lena had always been fascinated by old things. She loved the stories behind antique furniture, vintage clothing, and especially old houses. So when she found a dilapidated Victorian-style house for rent on the outskirts of town, she couldn't resist. It was cheap, too, almost suspiciously so, but the landlord assured her that no one had lived there in years, and he just wanted it occupied. He even offered her the first month free, which sealed the deal. The house was beautiful in a haunting way. Its wooden floors creaked underfoot, and the large windows were framed with heavy, dusty curtains. The grand staircase spiraled upward into the darkness, leading to a second floor that Lena hadn't fully explored yet. The first floor alone was enough to keep her busy for days, unpacking her things and cleaning the neglected rooms. It was on her third day in the house that she discovered the mirror. She was in one of the upstairs bedrooms, a spacious room with peeling wallpaper and a large bay window overlooking the overgrown garden. The mirror was hidden behind a stack of old furniture, its frame tarnished and cracked. It was tall, nearly as tall as Lena herself, and shaped like an elongated oval. The glass was cloudy and speckled with age, but as she wiped it down, she could see her reflection gradually coming into focus. There was something strange about the mirror, though. As Lena stared at herself, she felt a creeping sense of unease. The reflection looked just like her, but there was something off, something she couldn't quite place. The way the light hit her eyes, the slight curve of her lips, it was as if the image in the mirror had a mind of its own. She shook off the feeling, chalking it up to her imagination running wild in the old house. Still, she couldn't bring herself to move the mirror downstairs with the other furniture she planned to keep. Instead, she left it propped against the wall in the bedroom, out of sight, but not entirely out of mind. That night, as she lay in bed, Lena found herself thinking about the mirror again. The house was eerily silent, the kind of quiet that pressed down on her chest and made it hard to sleep. She tossed and turned, unable to shake the image of her reflection staring back at her. Suddenly, she heard a creak from upstairs, like a floorboard being stepped on. Lena froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The noise came again, followed by another, closer this time. It was as if someone was moving around in the room directly above her. Lena sat up in bed, straining to listen. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving in a steady rhythm. She held her breath, trying to convince herself it was just the house settling or a stray animal that had gotten inside. But deep down, she knew that wasn't the case. Gathering her courage, Lena climbed out of bed and grabbed the flashlight she kept by her nightstand. She crept out of her room and up the stairs, the old wood groaning under her feet. The house was pitch dark, the only light coming from the thin beam of her flashlight. As she reached the top of the stairs, the footsteps stopped. Lena hesitated, her hand trembling as she pointed the light down the hallway. The door to the bedroom where she had left the mirror was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible through the crack. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was cold, much colder than the rest of the house, and the air smelled musty and stale. The mirror still stood against the wall, but something was different. The glass was clearer now, reflecting the room in sharp detail. Lena's flashlight flickered as she approached the mirror, her reflection coming into view. She froze, a wave of nausea washing over her. The reflection was wrong, unmistakably wrong. The face in the mirror was hers, but the expression wasn't. It smiled at her, a slow, creeping grin that spread across its face in a way that made Lena's skin crawl. Her heart raced as she took a step back, but the reflection didn't follow her movements. It stayed still, that horrible smile fixed on its face, as if mocking her. Lena wanted to run, to get out of that room and never look back, but she was rooted to the spot. Her eyes were locked on the reflection, unable to look away. She watched in horror as it began to move, lifting a hand to wave at her, but her own hand remained by her side, shaking uncontrollably. She stumbled backward, her flashlight slipping from her grasp and clattering to the floor. The light went out, plunging the room into darkness. In the silence, Lena could hear the sound of her own breathing, ragged and panicked. And then she heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps again, but this time they were coming from behind her, inside the room. She whipped around, expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing. The room was empty, save for the old furniture and that cursed mirror. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Was it a trick of the light? A figment of her imagination? But then she felt it, a cold breath against the back of her neck. Lena's blood ran cold as she realized she wasn't alone. She turned back to the mirror, her pulse hammering in her ears. The reflection was gone. The mirror now showed only the empty room, the same one Lena was standing in. But the air felt thick, oppressive, as if something unseen was watching her, waiting. Without thinking, she lunged for the flashlight, fumbling with it until the beam of light flickered back on. She shone it at the mirror, half expecting to see that twisted grin again, but the glass remained blank. Panicked, Lena backed out of the room, slamming the door shut behind her. She raced down the stairs, her mind screaming at her to get out of the house. She grabbed her keys, threw on her coat, and bolted out the front door into the freezing night. She didn't stop until she was in her car, and with the engine roaring to life as she sped away from the house. Her hands were trembling, and she could hardly breathe as she glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that awful reflection staring back at her. But there was nothing, just her own terrified face, pale and ghostly in the dim light of the dashboard. Lena drove until she reached a motel on the edge of town, where she finally pulled over, shaking with fear. She sat there for a long time, trying to convince herself that it was over, that she was safe. But deep down, she knew she could never go back to that house. The next morning, Lena returned to the house with the landlord and a locksmith. She refused to go inside, instead watching from the car as they entered. She expected to hear about the broken mirror, but when the landlord emerged, his face was ashen.
Story number 4.
Without thinking, she lunged for until the beam of light flickered back on. She shone it at the mirror, half expecting to see that twisted grin again, but the glass remained blank. Panicked, Lena backed out of the room, slamming the door shut behind her. She raced down the stairs, her mind screaming at her to get out of the house. She grabbed her keys, threw on her coat, and bolted out the front door into the freezing night. She didn't stop until she was in her car, and with the engine roaring to life as she sped away from the house. Her hands were trembling, and she could hardly breathe as she glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that awful reflection staring back at her. But there was nothing, just her own terrified face, pale and ghostly in the dim light of the dashboard. Lena drove until she reached a motel on the edge of town, where she finally pulled over, shaking with fear. She sat there for a long time, trying to convince herself that it was over, that she was safe. But deep down, she knew she could never go back to that house. The next morning, Lena returned to the house with the landlord and a locksmith. She refused to go inside, instead watching from the car as they entered. She expected to hear about the broken mirror, but when the landlord emerged, his face was ashen. Without thinking, she lunged for the flashlight, fumbling with it until the beam of light flickered back on. She shone it at the mirror, half expecting to see that twisted grin again, but the glass remained blank. Panicked, Lena backed out of the room, slamming the door shut behind her. She raced down the stairs, her mind screaming at her to get out of the house. She grabbed her keys, threw on her coat, and bolted out the front door into the freezing night. She didn't stop until she was in her car, and with the engine roaring to life as she sped away from the house. Her hands were trembling, and she could hardly breathe as she glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that awful reflection staring back at her. But there was nothing, just her own terrified face, pale and ghostly in the dim light of the dashboard. Lena drove until she reached a motel on the edge of town, where she finally pulled over, shaking with fear. She sat there for a long time, trying to convince herself that it was over, that she was safe. But deep down, she knew she could never go back to that house. The next morning, Lena returned to the house with the landlord and a locksmith. She refused to go inside, instead watching from the car as they entered. She expected to hear about the broken mirror, but when the landlord emerged, his face was ashen. Without thinking, she lunged for the flashlight, fumbling with it until the beam of light flickered back on. She shone it at the mirror, half expecting to see that twisted grin again, but the glass remained blank. Panicked, Lena backed out of the room, slamming the door shut behind her. She raced down the stairs, her mind screaming at her to get out of the house. She grabbed her keys, threw on her coat, and bolted out the front door into the freezing night. She didn't stop until she was in her car, and with the engine roaring to life as she sped away from the house. Her hands were trembling, and she could hardly breathe as she glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that awful reflection staring back at her. But there was nothing, just her own terrified face, pale and ghostly in the dim light of the dashboard. Lena drove until she reached a motel on the edge of town, where she finally pulled over, shaking with fear. She sat there for a long time, trying to convince herself that it was over, that she was safe. But deep down, she knew she could never go back to that house. The next morning, Lena returned to the house with the landlord and a locksmith. She refused to go inside, instead watching from the car as they entered. She expected to hear about the broken mirror, but when the landlord emerged, his face was ashen. Without thinking, she lunged for the flashlight, fumbling with it until the beam of light flickered back on. She shone it at the mirror, half expecting to see that twisted grin again, but the glass remained blank. Panicked, Lena backed out of the room, slamming the door shut behind her. She raced down the stairs, her mind turning it over in her hands. There was something oddly familiar about it, something she couldn't quite place. She stared at it, her thumb tracing the worn edges. That night, she slept with the lights on, the key under her pillow. The next day, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She kept seeing shadows out of the corner of her eyes, hearing faint whispers that seemed to come from the walls. She decided to take a walk, get some fresh air, and clear her head. When she returned, her door was slightly ajar. Her heart stopped. She knew she had locked it. She pushed it open cautiously, stepping inside. Everything seemed normal at first, but then she noticed her bedroom door was closed, and she was certain she had left it open. Her heart pounded in her chest as she slowly approached the door. She reached for the knob, turning it gently, and pushed it open. Her blood ran cold. There on her bed was a single red rose. She backed away, her hand flying to her mouth, a scream caught in her throat. She turned to run, but then she heard it again, the slow, deliberate footsteps. She spun around, and there he was. Alex, standing in the doorway, a smile on his face that chilled her to the bone. "How did you?" she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. He held up the key, identical to the one she had. "You left it for me," he said softly. "Did you really think I'd ever let you go?" Emily's mind reeled. She had thought the key belonged to the previous tenant, but it had been Alex all along. He had been here, in her new place, watching, waiting, the whispers, the footsteps. It was him. "You shouldn't have tried to leave, Emily," he continued, stepping closer. "Now we're going to be together, just like before." She took a step back, her eyes darting to the door, calculating her chances of escape. His smile widened as he blocked her path. "There's no point," he whispered, his voice thick with madness. "You're mine. You've always been mine." In that moment, she realized the real horror wasn't the footsteps or the whispers. It was knowing that no matter where she went, no matter how far she ran, Alex would always find her.
Story number 5.
Title: The Collector. It was late evening when Emma first noticed the strange little shop. She had walked down this street dozens of times, but somehow she had never seen it before. The storefront was narrow and squeezed between two larger, more modern buildings. The glass windows were grimy, but she could make out an array of oddities and trinkets displayed inside. A small, hand-painted sign hung above the door, reading, "Curiosities and Keepsakes." Curiosity piqued, Emma decided to step inside. A small bell jingled as she opened the door, and the musty smell of old wood and forgotten memories greeted her. The shop was dimly lit, the only light coming from a few antique lamps scattered around. Shelves lined the walls, crammed with everything from dusty books to ancient-looking dolls and bizarre artifacts. She wandered through the aisles, fascinated by the strange assortment of items. It was as if the shop was a time capsule, filled with relics from the past, each with its own story to tell. As she turned a corner, she nearly bumped into an old man standing behind a glass counter. His sudden appearance startled her. She hadn't heard anyone else in the shop. "Good evening," the man said with a smile. His voice was soft, almost a whisper, and his eyes were sharp and gleaming like he knew something she didn't. "Anything catch your eye?" Emma hesitated, unsure how to answer. She had only come in out of curiosity, not intending to buy anything. "Just browsing," she said, returning his smile. "You have an interesting collection here." The old man nodded, his gaze never leaving her face. "I collect items with history, with meaning. Every piece here has a story, a memory attached to it." Emma found herself drawn to a small, ornate music box on the counter. It was made of dark wood, intricately carved, with swirling patterns and inlaid with tiny, glimmering stones. Something about it seemed familiar, though she couldn't quite place it. "This is beautiful," she murmured, reaching out to touch it. The man's smile widened. "Ah, the music box, one of my finest pieces. It once belonged to a young woman, not unlike yourself. She was very fond of it." Emma felt a strange chill as she traced her fingers over the smooth surface of the box. What happened to her? The man's expression darkened slightly. "She lost her way, I'm afraid, but her music box remains, a keepsake of her story." Something about his words unsettled Emma, but she couldn't deny the pull she felt toward the music box. "How much for it?" The man considered her for a moment before replying. "For you, it's free. A gift, if you will." Emma was taken aback. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely," he said, his smile returning. "It belongs with you now." Feeling a bit uneasy, but also oddly compelled, Emma accepted the music box. The old man wrapped it carefully in tissue paper and placed it in a small bag. As he handed it to her, he said, "Take care of it, and it will take care of you." Emma left the shop, the strange encounter lingering in her mind. By the time she got home, the evening had turned into night. She set the bag on her kitchen table, feeling a strange mix of excitement and trepidation. The music box was even more beautiful in the soft light of her apartment. She wound it up and opened the lid, expecting a soft, delicate melody to play. But instead, the room filled with an eerie, haunting tune that made her skin prickle. The melody was familiar, yet she couldn't place where she had heard it before. As the music played, Emma noticed something strange. Her reflection in the glass of her kitchen window seemed off. It was like a shadow hung over her face, darkening her eyes. She shook her head, trying to shake off the unease. It was just her imagination, she told herself. The strange shop, the old man, the haunting melody, it was all playing tricks on her mind. That night, Emma dreamed of the music box. In her dream, she was a little girl, standing in a dark room with the box in her hands. The haunting melody filled the air as she opened the lid, and as she looked inside, she saw something moving, a tiny, shadowy figure that seemed to reach out toward her. She woke up with a start, her heart pounding in her chest. For the next few days, the music box occupied Emma's thoughts. The strange, haunting tune played in her mind, following her everywhere she went. She began to feel as though she was being watched, like eyes were always on her, even when she was alone. The shadows in her apartment seemed to grow longer, darker, and the reflection in her windows always seemed just a bit off. One evening, after another restless day, she decided to confront the music box. She needed to understand why it was affecting her so deeply. She placed it on the table and wound it up again, the eerie melody filling the room. As the music played, she noticed something strange. Tiny movements within the box. She leaned in closer, her breath catching in her throat. The shadowy figure from her dream was there, small and barely visible, but undeniably real. It twisted and writhed, like smoke trapped in glass. Emma recoiled, her heart racing. She slammed the lid shut, but the music continued to play, growing louder and more insistent. She tried to push the box away, but it wouldn't budge, as if it were glued to the table. Panic set in as the shadows around her grew darker, creeping toward her like living things. In a desperate attempt to rid herself of the box, Emma grabbed a hammer from her drawer and brought it down hard on the wood. The impact sent a jolt through her arm, but the box remained unharmed, the music playing on. She hit it again and again, but the box refused to break. The shadows were closing in now, twisting around her, suffocating her. The reflection in the window had changed completely. It wasn't her face anymore, but something dark and twisted, grinning at her with hollow eyes. And then the music stopped. The room fell silent, the shadows retreating as quickly as they had appeared. The music box sat on the table, its lid slightly ajar, but no sound came from it. Emma collapsed into a chair, her body trembling with fear and exhaustion. She stared at the box, her mind racing. Whatever it wasn't just a simple trinket. It was something more, something ancient and malevolent. She had to get rid of it, destroy it somehow before it consumed her completely. The next morning, Emma took the box back to the shop. But when she arrived at the location, she found an empty lot. The strange little shop had vanished, leaving no trace that it had ever existed. She was left standing on the sidewalk, clutching the cursed music box in her hands, feeling the weight of its malevolence growing heavier with each passing moment. With no other option, Emma decided to bury the box deep in the woods outside of town. She drove far into the forest where the trees grew thick and the sunlight barely reached the ground. She dug a deep hole, dropped the box inside, and covered it with earth. As she stood over the freshly turned soil, she prayed that it was enough to rid herself of the curse. But as she turned to leave, she heard it.
Story number 6.
The caller. Cassie had forgotten about the box. It was one of the last things she packed when she left his place. She had thrown it into the back of her closet, trying to bury it along with the memories of Darren. She wanted to forget the way his hands gripped her too tightly, the way his voice would suddenly shift from sweet to menacing. After she moved to her new apartment, she thought she could finally start over. But the phone calls began. The first call came late one night around 2 a.m. She had been asleep, but the shrill ring cut through the silence like a knife. She groggily picked up her phone, squinting at the screen. The number was blocked. She answered, thinking it might be an emergency, but there was only silence on the other end. "Hello?" she said again, louder this time. Still, no response, just a faint crackling sound, like a bad connection. After a few more seconds, the line went dead. She brushed it off as a wrong number, but it left her uneasy. The next night, it happened again, this time at 3 a.m., the same blocked number, the same silence. "Who is this?" she demanded, but again, nothing. Just the faint sound of breathing, then the click of the line disconnecting. By the third night, Cassie was more annoyed than scared. She let it ring, refusing to answer. The calls continued at random times, sometimes during the day, but mostly in the dead of night. She changed her number, but the calls kept coming. It was always the same block number, the same eerie silence. A chill ran through her as a thought formed in her mind. Darren. He was the only one who'd ever gotten this obsessive. The thought that he might be behind it made her feel sick. She remembered his voice, calm but threatening. "If you ever leave, I'll make sure you regret it." She tried to convince herself that it couldn't be him. She'd blocked him on everything, deleted her accounts, and moved to a new city. How could he have found her? Still, the idea took root in her mind and wouldn't let go. Cassie decided to tell her friend, Jenna, about it. They met for coffee, and as she described the calls, Jenna's face grew serious. "You think it's him, don't you?" Jenna asked, her voice barely a whisper. Cassie nodded. "Who else would it be?" "Have you told the police?" Jenna suggested. Cassie shook her head. "What can they do? It's just a few phone calls. There's no proof it's him." Jenna sighed. "Just be careful, okay?" Cassie nodded, but she didn't feel reassured. That night, the calls started again, more frequent and insistent, each one making her pulse quicken with dread. She tried to ignore them, but then she heard the first whisper. "Cassie." The voice was low, almost a hiss, like someone speaking through clenched teeth. Her heart dropped into her stomach. She recognized the voice. It was Darren. She hung up immediately, her hands trembling. Her mind raced. How had he found her? And why now, after all this time? The next day, she went to the police. They were sympathetic, but couldn't do much. "It could be anyone," the officer said. "Without proof that it's him, there's not a lot we can do." Cassie felt a wave of helplessness wash over her. She returned home, her thoughts swirling. That night, the phone rang again. Her heart pounded in her chest, but this time she didn't answer. She watched as the screen lit up, vibrating against her nightstand, then went dark. Moments later, it rang again, and again. She felt herself start to panic. And then, just as suddenly, the calls stopped. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. Maybe he'd given up, maybe he realized she wasn't going to answer and had moved on. She let herself relax, just a little. She turned off the lamp and lay back down, pulling the covers up to her chin. Minutes passed. The room was silent, save for the sound of her breathing. She closed her eyes, willing herself to sleep. But just as she was starting to drift off, her phone buzzed again, but this time, it wasn't a call. It was a text message. She grabbed the phone, a knot tightening in her stomach. The message was from an unknown number. "I see you." Cassie felt her heart stop. Her eyes darted around the room, scanning the shadows. She quickly stood up and checked the locks on her windows and door, reassuring herself that everything was secure. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from the same unknown number. "I'm closer than you think." Cassie's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. She glanced at the phone, her mind racing. Should she call the police again? What would they do? She was alone, and Darren, or whoever this was, knew exactly where she was. Suddenly, her phone rang. She jumped, staring at the screen. Blocked number. Her hands shook as she hesitated, then answered, her voice barely a whisper. "What do you want?" There was a pause, and then the whisper again. "Look behind you." Cassie's blood ran cold. Her body was frozen, terror gripping every muscle. She wanted to turn, but fear kept her rooted in place. The phone slipped from her hand, hitting the floor with a dull thud. The room was silent except for her ragged breathing. Slowly, she turned around. There was nothing there, just the empty room and the shadows stretching across the walls. She let out a shaky breath, relief flooding through her. Maybe he was just trying to scare her. And then she heard it. A creaking sound, so soft it could have been her imagination. But it wasn't. It was coming from her closet. She stared at the door, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely think. The closet door was slightly ajar, just a sliver, but she hadn't left it like that. She took a step toward the closet, her hand reaching out, trembling. She could hear her own breath, shallow and fast, echoing in the silent room. She hesitated for a moment, then grabbed the doorknob and flung the door open. Inside, the clothes hung neatly, nothing out of place. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. But as she turned to close it, she saw something that made her blood freeze. A small, thin wire, barely visible, ran from the back of her closet to the door frame. She looked down and saw a tiny, almost invisible hole drilled into the closet wall, directly facing her bed. Her mind reeled as she realized what it meant. Someone had been watching her. From inside her apartment, her phone buzzed again, still on the floor. She picked it up, her hand shaking, and read the new message. "I told you I'm closer than you think." In a panic, she backed out of the room, dialing 911. But, as she turned to run, she saw something in the corner of her eye. A figure standing just outside her window, watching her with a smile that chilled her to the core. It wasn't Darren. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Whoever had been stalking her wasn't who she thought. And if it wasn't Darren, who else had been watching her all this time?
Story number 7.
Title: The Ghost of Regret. Anna had always felt uneasy around Jake. From the moment they started dating, there had been something off about him. It wasn't anything she could pinpoint, just a creeping feeling that something wasn't right. But by the time she realized how dangerous he truly was, it was too late. It had been almost a year since she broke up with Jake. The relationship had started out passionate and intense, but it quickly turned toxic. Jake was possessive, controlling, and prone to violent outbursts. When she finally mustered the courage to end things, he didn't take it well. The days following the breakup were filled with harassing messages, late-night calls, and cryptic notes left on her doorstep. Jake's behavior escalated until one night, he showed up at her apartment. His eyes wild, he screamed and banged on her door, demanding to be let in. Anna called the police, but by the time they arrived, Jake had vanished. She got a restraining order, changed her number, and even moved to a new apartment. After months of looking over her shoulder, things finally seemed to settle down. She thought she was free. Life was returning to normal, and Anna was beginning to feel like herself again. But then, small things started happening. At first, they were easy to dismiss. A creak in the floorboards, a misplaced object, the feeling of being watched. Anna chalked it up to paranoia, the residual fear from her time with Jake. But as the days passed, the incidents became more frequent and harder to ignore. One evening, Anna returned home after a long day at work to find her apartment in disarray. It wasn't as if someone had broken in, nothing was stolen, no locks were tampered with, but everything was off. Her books were pulled off the shelves, her furniture slightly moved, her clothes strewn across the floor. The sight made her heart race. She checked every room, every corner, but found no one. Anna called the police again, but there was nothing they could do without evidence of a break-in. They assured her that she was safe, that Jake was long gone, but Anna wasn't so sure. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching her, waiting for the right moment. That night, she locked every door and window and climbed into bed, her heart pounding in her chest. Sleep eluded her, her mind racing with thoughts of Jake. Had he found her? Was he inside her home, lurking in the shadows? Just as she was about to drift off, she heard it. A soft whisper, just inches from her ear. "Anna!" She shot up in bed, her breath caught in her throat. The room was dark, silent, but she knew what she heard. Panic surged through her as she reached for the lamp beside her bed, her hands trembling. She flicked it on, flooding the room with light. There was no one there. She spent the rest of the night huddled in bed, clutching her phone, every creak and groan of the apartment sending her into a fresh wave of terror. As dawn broke, exhaustion finally took over and she drifted into a fitful sleep. The next few days were a blur of anxiety and paranoia. Every time she came home, she found something else out of place. Her fridge magnets rearranged, her toothbrush wet when she hadn't used it, pictures on the wall hung at odd angles, and always, at night, the whispering, soft, insidious, growing louder with each passing night. Anna. By the end of the week, Anna was at her breaking point. She called her best friend Sarah and begged her to stay the night. Sarah, ever the rational one, tried to calm her down, suggesting it was all in her head, a reaction to the trauma Jake had caused. But Anna knew better. She could feel his presence, smell the faint scent of his cologne in the air. That night, with Sarah asleep beside her, Anna lay awake, listening. The whisper came again, clearer this time, right by her ear. "Anna, why did you leave me?" Anna bolted upright, her eyes wide with terror. She shook Sarah awake, her voice trembling as she tried to explain. But before she could get the words out, a loud crash echoed from the living room. Both women froze, their eyes locked in shared fear. They crept down the hallway, hearts pounding, and found the living room a mess. The coffee table was overturned, the couch cushions tossed to the floor, and in the center of the chaos, a single note written in Jake's handwriting. "You can't escape me." Terrified, they called the police again. This time, the officers took her seriously. They searched the entire apartment, but found no sign of forced entry, no indication that anyone had been there but the two women. Anna's fear spiraled into dread as the days passed. She began to notice a pattern. Every time she was alone, the strange occurrences would intensify. The whispering became more frequent, the rearranged objects more deliberate. She started hearing Jake's voice during the day, taunting her, laughing, reminding her of the things he used to say when he was angry. Then one evening, as Anna was looking through old photos on her phone, she found something that made her blood run cold. A recent picture of her sleeping in her bed taken from inside the room. She hadn't taken it. She didn't even remember being asleep when it was taken. In a panic, she rushed to the police station and showed them the photo. They took her seriously this time, launching an investigation. But as the days turned into weeks, they found nothing. No evidence of a break-in, no sign of Jake. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Exhausted and desperate, Anna decided to visit a local psychic, hoping for some sort of explanation, anything to help her understand what was happening. The psychic listened intently as Anna recounted her story, her eyes narrowing as Anna described Jake's death. "You say he died in a car accident?" the psychic asked, her voice low. Anna nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, just a week after I broke up with him. I thought it was over." The psychic shook her head, her expression grave. "It's not over, Anna. Jake isn't gone. His spirit is trapped, full of anger and regret. He's still here in this world, and he's not going to let you go. Not until he gets what he wants." Anna felt a chill run down her spine. What does he want? The psychic's eyes locked onto hers, filled with a sorrow that made Anna's heart ache. "He wants you, Anna. He wants you to join him." That night, as Anna lay in bed, she heard the whisper again, louder, more insistent. "Anna, come with me." And for the first time, she felt a pull, a cold hand gripping her heart, drawing her toward the darkness. She realized with dawning horror that she wasn't just dealing with the memory of Jake. She was dealing with his ghost. As the whispering grew louder, she closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face.
Story number 8.
Title: The Whispering Woods. Samantha had always loved the outdoors, but there was something about the forest near her new home that made her uneasy. She had moved to the small town of Graywood for a fresh start after a tumultuous breakup, hoping the peaceful surroundings would help her heal. The house she rented was quaint, nestled at the edge a dense forest that the locals called the Whispering Woods. The name was whimsical, but there was an edge to it that sent a shiver down her spine whenever she thought about it. The townspeople were friendly enough, but whenever the woods were mentioned, their expressions turned serious, almost fearful. Samantha had asked about it once at the local grocery store, and the old woman behind the counter had just shaken her head. "Stay out of those woods, dear. They're not safe, especially at night." Samantha had laughed it off at the time, thinking it was just a local legend meant to keep kids from wandering off. But after a few weeks of living so close to the forest, she couldn't ignore the strange feeling it gave her. It was as if the trees were watching her, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, and the wind carried whispers that she couldn't quite make out. One evening, after a long day at work, Samantha decided to go for a walk to clear her mind. The sun was setting, casting a golden light over the landscape, and the air was crisp and cool. Without thinking, she found herself heading toward the edge of the woods. The path was well worn, and she figured a short walk through the forest might not be so bad. After all, the warnings seemed silly in the daylight. As she ventured deeper into the woods, the trees grew denser, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the fading sunlight. The path narrowed, and the air grew colder, carrying with it a damp, earthy scent. Samantha wrapped her arms around herself, regretting not bringing a jacket. The further she walked, the quieter it became. The sounds of birds and insects faded until the only noise was the crunch of leaves beneath her boots. She paused for a moment, taking in the eerie stillness. That's when she heard it, a faint whisper, carried on the breeze. At first, she thought it was just the wind rustling the leaves, but the sound was too distinct, too deliberate. It was as if someone or something was speaking in a low, breathy voice. She strained to listen, her heart beginning to race. Sam! Her blood ran cold. It was her name, clear as day, whispered from somewhere deep within the trees. She spun around, searching the shadows for any sign of movement, but saw nothing. The woods were still, almost unnaturally so. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. The only response was the whisper again, this time louder, more insistent. It was coming from the direction of a narrow, overgrown trail that branched off from the main path. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to leave the woods and never return. But something about the voice tugged at her, drawing her closer. It was familiar, though she couldn't place where she had heard it before. Against her better judgment, she followed the sound, her footsteps echoing in the silence. As she walked, the whispering grew louder, filling her head with an incessant murmur. It wasn't just one voice now, but many, all whispering her name, urging her forward. The trees seemed to close in around her, their branches twisting into unnatural shapes, and the path beneath her feet became rough and uneven. Suddenly, the trail opened into a small clearing, bathed in the pale light of the rising moon. In the center of the clearing stood a large, gnarled tree, its bark dark and rough like ancient stone. The whispers stopped abruptly as she stepped into the clearing, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed down on her chest. Samantha approached the tree, her eyes drawn to something carved into the bark. It was a name, her name, etched deeply into the wood, along with a date. The date sent a chill through her. It was the day she had moved to Graywood. She stumbled back, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. This couldn't be possible. How could her name be here, carved into a tree she had never seen before? And why did it feel like the whispers were coming from the tree itself, as if it were alive and aware of her presence? As she backed away, she tripped over something and fell to the ground. Looking down, she saw a small, weathered notebook lying half buried in the dirt. The cover was faded, but she could make out the initials SW embossed on the front, her initials. Hands trembling, she picked up the notebook and opened it. The pages were filled with entries written in a neat, familiar script. Her script. She flipped through the pages, horror dawning as she realized they were diary entries she had written over the past few months, detailing her move to Graywood, her feelings about the breakup, and even her unease about the woods. But there was more. As she reached the last few pages, the entries changed. The handwriting grew erratic, almost frantic, and the words were jumbled, nonsensical. The final entry was dated tomorrow, and it was only a single sentence. I am lost. They took me. Samantha's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the words. How could this be? She hadn't written this, hadn't even seen this notebook before. But as she held it in her hands, a wave of memories washed over her, memories that weren't hers. She saw herself wandering through these woods night after night, drawn by the whispers, searching for something she couldn't remember. Panic set in as the whispers returned, louder and more desperate than before. The voices weren't just calling her name now, they were pleading, crying out in fear and pain. She tried to stand, to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The ground beneath her seemed to shift, pulling her down.
Story number 10.
The Midnight Trail. Lena never wanted to hike alone, especially not at night, but tonight was different. Tonight, she felt the urge to escape, to clear her mind of all the mess her life had become. Her breakup with Josh had been the last straw, an ugly, screaming match that ended with her storming out of his apartment, slamming the door behind her. She needed the fresh air, the solitude. So she grabbed her flashlight and headed for the nearby trail that wound up through the woods, just a few miles from her new place. The trail was eerily quiet, the thick canopy overhead blocking out most of the moonlight. Only the soft crunch of her boots on the path broke the silence. She held her flashlight steady, the beam cutting through the darkness ahead. The cold night air was biting, but she felt an odd comfort in the solitude, away from the noise of the city and the chaos of her thoughts. As she walked deeper into the forest, she began to feel a little calmer. Then, somewhere in the distance, she heard it, the faint crack of a branch snapping underfoot. She paused, turning her head toward the sound, her breath catching in her throat. Probably just an animal, she muttered to herself, trying to suppress the flicker of fear. She had heard stories of coyotes in these woods, but they usually kept their distance from humans. She kept walking, but the uneasiness crept back in. Every now and then she thought she heard something. A rustle in the bushes, a whisper of leaves against the wind, footsteps echoing her own. She stopped and shined her flashlight around. Nothing, just the thick trunks of trees and the shadows they cast. She forced herself to keep moving, determined to finish the hike. But after another few minutes, she heard it again. A louder snap, this time much closer. Her heart rate quickened. She spun around, shining her light behind her. Nothing. She could feel the cold sweat forming on her palms, her grip on the flashlight tightening. She told herself it was just her imagination. "Get a grip, Lena," she whispered. But then she saw it. A figure standing just off the trail, barely illuminated by the edges of her flashlight beam. Her heart nearly stopped. It was just a shadow at first, but as she focused, she could make out the shape of a person, standing completely still, half hidden behind a tree. "Hello?" she called out, trying to keep her voice steady, but it came out shaky and weak. No response. She took a step back, then another, never taking her eyes off the figure. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice louder now, edged with panic. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching her. She could barely see any details. It seemed to be wearing dark clothes, a hood maybe, but it was hard to tell. Her mind raced. Could it be Josh? Had he followed her here, angry, looking for a fight? "Josh?" she called, more uncertain now. If this is some kind of joke, it's not funny. Still, nothing. Just that silent, immobile silhouette. She turned, deciding it was time to go back. She could feel her pulse pounding in her ears as she quickened her pace, her footsteps echoing through the still night air. Then she heard the footsteps again, this time unmistakable. Whoever was behind her was following, and their pace was quickening too. Panic surged through her veins. She broke into a run, the flashlight bouncing in her hand, its beam zigzagging across the trail. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her heart pounding as she tried to remember the way back to the trailhead. But the footsteps behind her were relentless, growing louder, closer. She didn't dare look back. She just kept running, faster and faster, her legs burning with effort. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it again. That same figure, somehow now ahead of her, standing in the middle of the trail. She skidded to a stop, nearly tripping over her own feet. Her chest heaved as she tried to catch her breath. How could they have gotten ahead of her? It wasn't possible. She turned to run back the other way, but as she did, she saw another figure, identical to the first, standing behind her. Her mind spun. Two of them? How could there be two? She backed away, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly between the two figures. She was trapped. "Who are you?" she screamed, her voice breaking with fear. The figures began to move, slowly closing in on her. She could feel the ground beneath her shifting, the trees seeming to close in. She turned to the side, darting off the trail and into the dense brush, branches tearing at her clothes and skin as she ran. Her flashlight flickered, the batteries failing, and then went dark. She plunged into darkness, her breath coming in frantic gasps, her eyes wide as she stumbled blindly through the undergrowth. She could hear them following, their footsteps getting closer, more deliberate. Her foot caught on a root and she went sprawling, hitting the ground hard. Pain shot up her leg as she tried to get up, but it buckled beneath her. She could feel them closing in, hear the soft rustle of their steps. She grabbed a branch, using it to haul herself up, her heart hammering in her chest. She limped forward, each step agony. But she forced herself to keep moving. She couldn't stop, couldn't let them catch her. She saw a faint light ahead, just a tiny glimmer through the trees. The trailhead. It had to be. She pushed herself toward it, willing herself not to look back, to focus on that light. It grew brighter as she approached, a beacon in the darkness. She stumbled out of the brush and onto the trail, her lungs burning, tears streaming down her face. She looked back, expecting to see the figures right behind her, but there was nothing, just the dark, empty forest. She waited, her breath ragged, every muscle in her body tense. No movement, no sound, just silence. Had she imagined it all? Had she let her fear get the best of her? She laughed, a shaky, half-crazed laugh, relief flooding through her. But then she saw it, the faint glimmer of something on the ground near the edge of the trail. She crouched down, shining her dim flashlight on it. Her heart nearly stopped. It was a small piece of cloth, torn and dirty, but unmistakably familiar, a piece of Josh's favorite hoodie. Her stomach twisted. She knew he hadn't been behind her, but maybe he had been ahead. Maybe he had come here first. Maybe he had been waiting for her all along. And then she heard it again. A single, soft footstep right behind her. She spun around.
Story number 11.
Title: The Shadow Behind. Mia thought she had finally moved on. The day she ended things with Eric, she felt a weight lift off her shoulders. The relationship had been suffocating. Eric was sweet at first, but soon became possessive, jealous, and increasingly volatile. She felt like a prisoner, constantly watched and controlled. Breaking up with him was the hardest decision she had ever made, but it was also the most liberating. For months after the breakup, Eric bombarded her with texts, calls, and desperate attempts to win her back. When those failed, he turned to threats. Mia was scared, but determined to stay strong. She blocked his number, changed her social media accounts, and even moved to a new apartment across town. Slowly, the messages stopped, and Mia started to believe she was free. But then the dreams began. At first, they were vague and hazy, just shadows in the dark, a faceless figure watching her from the corner of her room. Mia would wake up drenched in sweat, her heart racing, but she convinced herself it was just residual anxiety. After all, she had been through a lot, and nightmares were to be expected. However, the dreams grew more vivid. In them, she would see Eric, standing in the doorway of her bedroom, his eyes cold and empty. He would just stand there, staring at her, a twisted smile on his face. No matter how much she tried to scream, her voice was always silenced by an invisible force. One night, Mia jolted awake, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The dream had been so real, she could still feel Eric's icy gaze on her. She looked around her dark room, her eyes scanning every shadow. And then, in the dim light, she saw it. A figure standing in the corner of her room, exactly where Eric had stood in her dream. Her heart nearly stopped. She blinked, and the figure was gone, as if it had never been there. But the fear remained, settling deep in her bones. She spent the rest of the night wide awake, every creak of the apartment sending her heart racing. Over the next few days, strange things began happening. Mia would come home from work to find the door slightly ajar, though she was sure she had locked it. Her belongings were moved. Nothing major, just little things, like her keys in the wrong place, or her shoes neatly lined up by the door when she remembered leaving them scattered. She began to feel watched, a constant prickling sensation on the back of her neck, like someone was standing right behind her. She would whip around, expecting to see someone, but there was never anyone there. Her dreams became more intense, always featuring Eric in the corner, sometimes whispering her name, other times just staring at her with that unnerving smile. Mia started questioning her sanity. She wondered if the stress was getting to her, if maybe she was losing her grip on reality. But then, one night, something happened that made her realize it was not all in her head. She had just settled into bed, the lamp on her nightstand casting a warm glow in the room. Her eyes were heavy, but sleep refused to come. As she lay there, staring at the ceiling, she heard it, the faint sound of breathing. It wasn't hers, it was slow, deliberate, and coming from the foot of the bed. Mia froze, her breath catching in her throat. She didn't dare move, didn't dare look. The breathing grew louder, closer, and then she felt it, a cold hand brushing against her foot. She screamed, bolting upright and scrambling for the light. But when the room flooded with light, there was no one there. The door was still locked, the windows shut tight, but the unmistakable chill of a presence lingered in the air. She didn't sleep that night, nor the next. Every night, the breathing returned, the cold touch that seemed to grow bolder with each passing hour. Mia knew she couldn't stay in that apartment any longer. The next morning, she packed a bag and left, booking a room in a small motel on the outskirts of town. The first night at the motel was eerily quiet, no dreams, no strange noises. Mia finally felt a small sense of relief, thinking she had escaped whatever had been haunting her. But when she woke up the next morning, she found a note on the pillow beside her. Written in the same handwriting as Eric's old love letters, it read, "You can't run from me, Mia. I'll always be with you." Panic surged through her. She knew Eric wasn't just haunting her dreams. He was here, in some way she couldn't explain, but felt with every fiber of her being. Desperate, Mia contacted a medium she had heard about from a friend. The woman agreed to meet with her the next day. When Mia explained everything that had been happening, the medium's face grew pale. "It's not just his spirit that's haunting you," the medium said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's a shadow of his obsession. When he died..." Mia interrupted. "Died? What do you mean? Eric isn't dead." The medium looked at her, confused. "But he is. Eric died in a car accident 3 weeks ago." Mia's blood ran cold. "No, that's not possible. I've been seeing him. He's been in my dreams, in my apartment. He touched me." The medium shook her head. "Sometimes when someone dies with strong emotions, especially unresolved ones like obsession or hatred, they leave behind something more than a ghost. It's a shadow, a fragment of their darkest desires, and it's attached to you." Mia felt like the ground was slipping out from under her. Eric was dead, but his obsession had somehow transcended death, clinging to her like a dark stain she couldn't wash off. The medium performed a cleansing ritual that night, but it didn't work. The shadow was too strong, too deeply intertwined with Mia's life. No matter where she went, she could feel it, lurking just out of sight. It was always behind her, just as it had been in her dreams. As the days turned into weeks, Mia's strength waned. She became a ghost of her former self, haunted by the shadow of a man who wouldn't let her go, even in death. One night, as she sat in her motel room, staring at the mirror, she noticed something horrifying. Her reflection was off. It was her face, her body, but there was something else, another figure standing just behind her, dark and twisted, with a familiar, terrifying smile.